Hello all, and welcome to what is probably the most comprehensive headlight test of these Osram, that's what they're marketed as, 4x6 LED headlights. Now before I even get started, I want to say, just to be absolutely clear, that I bought these from a seller on Amazon called LX Light, and one of them showed up slightly defective. There were some plastic shavings inside the lenses. Being a sealed unit, you really couldn't get it out. So they actually made me the offer of a complete set of 4 of these for free, in addition to the ones I had, if I was going to give them a positive review. I kindly said no thanks. I would just like a replacement for the one that's defective. So they did. They sent me replacement for it. So all that said, this is completely unbiased because I owe them nothing, and they're a good seller because they did step up to the plate with no complaints and, you know, replace the one. There's a bunch of vendors that sell these things. Anyway, let's do a quick unboxing of this guy here. So this is what they come in. A 4-pack comes in 4 white boxes, basically the same thing taped together. This is the replacement one they sent me. So when you open this guy up, this is what you get. Here's the light itself with protective film. You can see some of the driving light chips here. These are on as a marker light, or whenever they're on, there's a separate connection for them. These 3 units in the middle are the low beam, and then these 8 are the high beams. It's a cast aluminum housing. It's actually very nicely made. This is for this lead here is for the driving lights, and then here's the connector. It's pretty much a standard connector. And they give you, in case your pinout doesn't match the pinout on the back of the light, they give you this adapter cable, which does the job. And it's interesting to note that my pinout on my car actually didn't match this. So I just repinned the connectors rather than using these. But these are actually pretty nice, and normally you'd have to pay extra for them. So overall, it's a pretty good deal. So this is what we'll be testing. It has the DOT SAE label on it. Is it really DOT tested? I don't know, but we'll find out how good it is as far as DOT specs, specifically not blinding people. That's the biggest problem, especially with cheaper LED lights. They have a very poor cutoff. So we'll be testing this guy against one of the other headlights from the car. This is the low beam. This is the one that's in better condition. It's plastic housing. It's got a halogen bulb inside of it. We'll see how it does. And then this is the overall setup here. We'll be using this power supply over here, which can easily provide more than enough current. It does up to 5 amps, so it'll never hit current limiting. So it's going to be a true test of the output of these guys, because they don't take anywhere near 5 amps. And I will use this light meter to go ahead and take measurements. So, and I have it set to lux right now, and in here at the moment there are probably, I don't know, maybe 300 watts worth of fluorescent lights in here. So it's a fairly bright space, and it's coming up as 240 lux. I don't know if you can see that, but 240 lux, so that's a reference point. This is a bright space and it's well lit. The other thing to note is that I'm going to run the camera with a manual lens. I'm going to set the exposure, and I'm not going to adjust it. So what you're going to see is not adjusted by ISO or aperture or any of that stuff. So it's going to be a true representation. So let's get on with the test. I'm going to test, I think maybe, let's say 11 volts, 12 volts, 13 volts, and 14 volts. It's important to note that most older lighting systems do not have relays in them, so all the current runs through the headlight switch, typically, that you pull out, and there's a lot of loss. In the LTD, however, I've rewired the whole thing, so it's running through a relay. There's 12 gauge wire running to the headlights, so it's an absolute best case scenario. I can tell you that before I did that, I was lucky to see 11 volts at the headlights. So right now the headlights actually aren't dim, but the problem is I lost a high beam and they're getting kind of hard to find, and these better ones have come down in price to a point that's reasonable. There used to be one that was sold by JW Speaker. I don't remember exactly, but they were like $240 a light, which is just poor economy. I mean, if you're going to spend $1,000 on headlights, I can think of better things to spend $1,000 on. So anyway, so that's going to be the complete test. And again, it's going to be 11 volts, 12 volts, 13 volts, and 14 volts. And then I'm going to put this light back in, and we're going to take the car for a drive, and I will show you what it looks like in real life. So having said that, we're going to test against, let me see if I can tilt up. This is a cheap tripod. 12 feet away, the garage door. So that's going to be our test point. So I'm going to set this whole thing up, and let's have at it. Just one more thing before we get on with the test. We're going to be measuring lux, because lux is the amount of light falling at one point. Lumens are the total light output of a light, and typically that's used for measuring the output of bulbs or any kind of bare source not in a fixture. And in order to measure lux, you have to put the bulb in space, in usually a globe type thing with a sensor in it, and then it extrapolates, and it's just not a very practical thing for what we're trying to do here. Here we're trying to figure out how much light is actually getting on the road, because for example, if this does have a good solid cutoff, then you can bet there's going to be some loss inside the housing. So while the LEDs inside might be putting out a lot more lumens, the lux output out the front at a particular point is going to be greatly reduced. So we'll see how effective that is. And also we're going to measure 3 points across the garage. We'll also measure current consumption too in watts and amps, of course. But if you have amps, you can figure out watts, but you knew that. So let's get on with it. Here's the tungsten headlight, the old one, at 11 volts. It's reading 2.4 amps and 26.45 watts. Now let's go measure the lux output in the middle and on either side. So we get 420 right there. And then in the middle of this panel, we've got 17. Middle of this panel, 9. So at 12 volts, we picked up a whole 100 lux right in the middle and a little bit on the sides. This is probably a best case scenario for most vehicles with original wiring. I really doubt you're going to get much more than 12 volts going to the actual headlights. Like I said, in the LTD, however, because it's been rewired, you actually get pretty close to alternator voltage. So it's going to be a little tougher challenge for the LEDs. So at 13 volts, we picked up 120 lux from 12 volts, which picked up 100 lux from 11 volts. But basically, all the sins still remain. The spread is poor, the cutoff is practically non-existent except off on the sides. Let's try 14. So here we are at 14 volts. This is a situation that's basically never going to happen. However, it did pick up by far the most brightness going from 13 to 14 volts. Even the wiring with the relay and all that, and the heavy gauge wiring in the LTD is probably not going to see this. But in the middle you have 840, which is a full 200 lux more than 13 volts, and 40 on the left and 20 on the right. It's interesting to note that the current draw, of course, goes up, power goes up. I'm not expecting to see that from the LED because the LED is going to have an internal driver and it's going to be current limited. So it's going to pull a fixed amount of power. And before we carry on to the LED light, it's a quick note about the high beams. The high beams are basically exactly the same, just shifted up. Let me see if I can do this without screwing up the display too bad. All right, so that's the high beam. You can see it's higher. Brightness is basically the same. It's just a relocated filament is all it is. Power draw is basically 1 watt higher, maybe at 39 watts. But again, low beam, high beam. All right, one other thing I wanted to mention about the LED before we do the tests. It comes with these driving lights, which have a separate connector. The driving lights actually come on whether you're running low beam or high beam, and also it's important to note that all 4 LED lights are identical, so they both have low and high beam functionalities. So if you wanted more light, I guess in theory you could run all 4 headlights at low beam all the time. And then, you know, just kick in the high beams and blind the daylights out of everyone. But this is what the driving lights look like. So nice little accents on either side. The camera is actually reading them a little bluer than they appear. The color rendering is actually pretty decent. They're not like hyper blue or anything strange. The space in here is lit with basically tungsten corrected light. So that's why it looks blue at the moment. So let's get on with the test with this guy. So here we are with 11 volts and the LED light. It's pretty much a whole different ball game. It actually has a cutoff, which is what I was really looking for, because as I mentioned, tungsten light's not so good, and most of the cheap LED lights have a terrible cutoff. This one is, in a word, spectacular. Again, this is 11 volts. It's only running 1.3 amps, which is about 14.65 watts. Let's take some lighting measurements. All right, so what we have here is a hotspot that is significantly not as bright as the tungsten, even at 11 volts, 180 lux, but the spread is epically better. It's not even close. It's actually a factor, close to a factor of, let's say 5 on one side and 10 on the other. That's pretty huge. So it's a nice even spread with an actual cutoff. Now let's try 12 volts. So let's check out the high beam functionality on this guy and see where we're at. Okay, in high beam mode, this thing is an absolute cannon. There's just no way around it. It completely destroys the tungsten light in spread, brightness, and everything else. The next step will be to put the tungsten light back in the driver's side of the LTD and leave the LED lights, which are already installed in the passenger side of the LTD, and let's go for a drive and see if that hotspot makes a difference, and let's see if the spread makes a difference. So let's take these things for a test drive here. On the left hand side we have the old tungsten light, and on the right hand side we have the LED light. As I mentioned, I've rewired my headlights so they run through a relay, so I expect the tungsten light to do better when the car is running, but let's take a look at just straight off battery, which is what I think most people will see who haven't bothered to take the time to rewire the cars. So yeah, you see basically a hotspot in the tungsten light and a whole lot of LED light. So let's take it for a drive and find out. I haven't done this yet. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention. The LED lights are a little bit heavier than regular tungsten lights. They weigh about 1.5 pounds each. It's only important to people like me. But, you know, told you it was going to be comprehensive. Now you can see it's notably brighter now. And it's cold outside too. So let's take it for a drive and see if that hotspot makes a difference. It's kind of interesting. It's like a flashlight versus a floodlight. Alright, so basically I'm seeing just a little patch of light there where the tungsten light is, and a whole lot of LED light. The tungsten is actually hard to see, but it's there. test. Even though the tungsten has that one hot spot that's pretty bright, right now it's sitting around 14 volts. The LED makes the sides of the road light up and everything else. We gotta try to find a street with no streetlights. It's gonna be tough around here. Let's try the high beams real quick. Oh my god. That's pretty good. So you can barely make out the tungsten light. Get around the corner past these other lights here. Tungsten has a little bit more throw, but only in that one spot. And there's your high beams. Oh my god. That's insane. Wow, it's like seeing a friggin' future. Now, the best part is around here, morons drive with their high beams on all the time. Turn these things on, you get brain damage. And impressions. Well, I think these LEDs are going to stay in the car, I can tell you that. In that one spot, they don't quite have as much throw. But the overall spread of light, actually, I never thought I'd say this comparing LED to tungsten, but in this particular application, the quality of light is better. It lights up the signs, you can see stuff, you're not blinding people. Overall, I think these get a thumbs up. And if you really wanted to throw more light down, since all four headlights are basically the same, you could wire 4 low beams in and leave those on all the time, and then of course you have the freaking death ray of the high beams, you know, where